Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lawrence City Commission meeting. Today marks the 17th anniversary of 9/11, a day that many of us will never forget. We remember the victims who lost their lives and the heroes who gave theirs. Through them lives the love, hope, and resilience of our future generations. Let's take a moment of silence to honor their memory. Thank you. We'll start our meeting today with receiving a presentation from the Douglas County National Alliance for Mental Illness Steering Committee.
Good evening, Mayor Boley and our City Council. I'm Bill Wood, and this is Jim Wilder. We are members of the local National Alliance for Mental Illness Steering Committee. In the past 3 to 4 years, there have been many people in this community working towards better treatment and services for those living with mental illness. We're making progress in our community towards these goals and want to recognize and say thank you to some of the people who have helped make those improvements. In the spring of 2015, then Police Chief Khatib determined that he wanted to see 100% of his officers trained in crisis intervention training. It's a 40-hour class on how to better understand and deal with those suffering from a mental illness. The City Council gave its full support to Chief Khatib's goal, and we started holding classes twice a year. This October's CIT class will mean that 100% of the officers have been through the training. I'm a NAMI representative on the CIT Planning Committee, and I've heard testimonies already of improved interaction between officers and those with mental illness. Then in January of 2017, Chief Khatib came back to this group and asked for funding for a mental health squad to make more improvements. The City Council asked him at that time to come back with a little more information, and by August, the mental health team was in place due to the support of the City Council. On behalf of the NAMI Douglas County, we want to say thank you to you for your support of these improvements in mental health care in our community. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, Bill. Thank you, Lisa. All right.
Stuart, thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also want to recognize tonight the mental health team, comprised of a partnership between the Lawrence Police Department and Burt Nash. We appreciate what you do day in and day out to provide better services to those living with mental illness. Why don't you go ahead and stand, the team here. I know you follow up with the individuals and family members after you've had interaction with them to help them plug into the services that are available in our community and to try and prevent repeat interactions with the police. The team is comprised of officers Ryan Halstead, Amber Roden, and Sarah Mills, and then Susan Hadel and Nicole Riles from Burt Nash. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We'll next have a proclamation on Lawrence Drive Electric Day.
Good evening, Mayor Boley. My name is Michael Allman. I'm with Sustainability Action Network. As you probably know by now, that our organization basically is all about ecological sustainability. And given that so much of our society is highly dependent on fossil fuels, we have a pretty negative impact on the ecology of the planet, particularly the climate warming. So we advocate for ways to reduce use of fossil fuels. The event that we're sponsoring this weekend, the Drive Electric Showcase, is one of the better ways to reduce use of fossil fuels, petroleum fuels, by using electric cars. Right now, the transportation sector has surpassed the electric generation sector in climate warming gases. So we focus on any way that transportation can reduce fossil fuels. That's one reason we advocate for bikeways, for example. This weekend, however, we're advocating for and celebrating electric vehicles. It's going to be, we think, a very exciting event. We are going to hold this event at the Community Mercantile parking lot there. We have about 17 electric vehicles, which also include bicycles, hopefully an electric tractor, an electric plug-in tricycle, a number of different vehicles. So I invite all of you to come. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Mercantile, the Wakarusa Group of the Sierra Club, and also I also definitely want to thank two of our commissioners, Vice Mayor Larson, who is going to be bringing her electric bicycle, and Commissioner Ananda, who's going to be bringing her electric car. So I want to thank you all and appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Did you want
Okay.
Hi, my name's Karen Pagel-Miners. I'm co-chair of the local Sierra Club group and also a co-captain with Michael on this Lawrence Drives Electric Week project. And I'd like to I can echo what Michael said, but also just if people are at all curious about electric vehicles and sort of this wave of the future in one direction or another, this is an easy, enjoyable, casual way to kind of get informed. And I just like to encourage any and everyone to just come down to the Merc on Saturday afternoon and see what's there.
Thank you. We'll go ahead with the proclamation. Whereas petroleum-fueled vehicles are responsible for over 50% of our local greenhouse gas emissions and are a contributing factor to air pollution and climate disruption, threatening the health of our citizens and the sustainability of our planet, and plug-in electric vehicles use 1/5 the energy used by internal combustion vehicles and get 100 miles per gallon equivalent or better, and whereas plug-in electric vehicles produce no greenhouse gas emissions when charged with renewable energy, and only 1/5 of the greenhouse gas emissions when charged with fossil fuels, and whereas September 8 to 16, 2018 has been designated as National Drive Electric Week throughout the United States to educate our citizens about the benefits of plug-in electric vehicles and to promote their adoption. Now, therefore, I, Stuart Boley, Mayor of the City of Lawrence, Kansas, do hereby proclaim Saturday, September 15, 2018 to be Lawrence Drive Electric Day and encourage all citizens to attend the Lawrence Electric Vehicle Showcase at 901 Iowa Street between 1 and 4 p.m. And we're now going to proclaim Sunday, September 16th as the 150th anniversary of the first regular missionary Baptist church. Gentlemen?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor,
Good evening.
all of the commissioners. Truly grateful to be here this evening. I am Pastor Arsenio Runyon, representing the First Regular Missionary Baptist Church, located at 1646 Vermont Street, This Sunday, we will be honoring our 150th year church anniversary. First Regular Missionary Baptist Church has been an intricate part of this Lawrence community. Back in 1903, during the historic flood, it was our church bell that was rang that informed all of the citizens here in the Lawrence community that there was a flood that was coming from the Kansas River. And at that time, all racism began to be washed away. There were African Americans as well as Caucasians and everyone else that was housed at our historic church. And we were able to come together as a united force, and which we are continuing to do even in 2018, inviting all races, creeds, etc., to be a part of our ministry. So, Mr. Mayor, we do certainly thank you.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and read the proclamation. Whereas the first regular missionary Baptist church of North Lawrence was organized in 1868 at 416 Lincoln Street, and during the Lawrence flood of 1903, it served as a place of refuge for North Lawrence residents until rescue workers could remove them safely by boats. And whereas in 1987, the congregation relocated to 1646 Vermont Street, where it remains today. Whereas Sunday, September 16th, 2018, marks the 150th anniversary of the first regular missionary Baptist church, and the theme of the service that day will be Rooted in Faith, Honoring Our Legacy. Now, therefore, I, Stuart Boley, Mayor of the City of Lawrence, Kansas, do hereby proclaim Sunday, September 16th, 2018, as the 150th anniversary of the first regular missionary Baptist church. Okay, we'll move on to the consent agenda. All matters listed below on the consent agenda are considered under one motion and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on those items. If discussion is desired, that item will be removed from the consent agenda and will be considered separately. Members of the public wishing to speak to an item that's been pulled off of the consent agenda will be limited to 3 minutes for comments. Is there something that the commission would like to pull off the consent agenda?
Item 8, please.
Number 8.
Number 9.
I'm going to pull number 2. Is there anything that a member of the public would like to pull from the consent agenda?
9.
We've got 9 with Matthew. Thank you. Okay. I would entertain a motion.
Move that we approve the consent agenda, including all claims with the exception of items 2, 8, and 9.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Ananda, second from Commissioner Herbert. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That was unanimous. So the second item is mine. I'm going to discuss the Senior Resource Center for Douglas County minutes. Reviewing the minutes prompted me to seek some more information. I had a good discussion with the chair of the Senior Resource Center board. One of the things that we discussed was the possibility of Commissioner Ananda, and we talked about this some time ago, some months ago, being appointed to the board. And their analysis of my suggestion that Commissioner Ananda would be on their board was that it would be a conflict of interest. I'm concerned about that and would welcome staff consideration of whether having a commissioner serve on a governing board would entail a conflict of interest.
You know, instead of turning to the city attorney at this point and asking for a on-the-spur-of-the-moment opinion, I think it'd probably be best that you just give us direction, and we'll be glad to take that issue up with the city attorney and give the attorney's office time to review the issue. We have a number of governance boards beyond SRC.
That's really one of the reasons that I'm concerned about this. I served myself on the Explorer Lawrence Board for
Right.
a couple of years. I believe Commissioner Larson's on there now, Vice Mayor Larson.
You're right.
And we have felt that it was appropriate for us to be on governing
Right.
boards. So I'm concerned about this. It was raised by the chair of the SRC board. So if it's okay with my fellow commissioners, we can provide that direction that we will ask that question of legal and here in due course.
That sounds good.
Sounds good to
I
me.
think it's appropriate.
Okay. I guess we could also open this up for public comment. There's also a possibility of conversation about anything else on item two.
The other thing I'd point out is I think it's kind of standard procedure for members to be appointed by the commission and members of the commission to serve on various governance boards, and we have other examples besides the SRC. And in some cases, I would venture that the statutes may even require some appointments to
The library
occur.
board.
Yeah, so I think you're gonna get back an opinion that suggests that it's perfectly legal to do that. Sometimes ethical reactions are different. They don't need to be a violation of the law, but they tend to take on the appearance issue. And maybe that's the issue that was raised, not necessarily the legal issue, but we'll be glad to take a look at it and get back to you.
Okay.
It looks like they're updating their bylaws as well, so that might be a good time to check them out and make sure there's nothing in there that is contrary to the changes that we've been making in the past year for a
Yeah.
template.
Yeah, that's a good point, Commissioner. One of the things that I noted was a composition change in their board, and a significant change when it comes to the, who does the appointment. And there's a change occurring which moves away from appointments by the city commission in terms of the numbers to a much reduced singular appointee. And one of the things that I would be concerned about is the reaction of the city commission. We just entered into a new arrangement with our senior center facility. And part of that arrangement talked about our relationship with SRC. But at the time we entered into that, we weren't in a position where we had contemplated any composition of board change on the part of the SRC. So that's something I'd at least like to take a look at as well, and maybe have more discussion with representatives of the SRC at some point. But tonight, you're just reviewing the minutes, and
Right.
so we'll take a look at those issues in return.
We have the opportunity for public comment on this issue. Okay.
I would move that we receive the minutes with direction to staff to review the ethical and legal implications of a commission appointment on the SRC.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Vice Mayor Larson. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so that's number 2. Number 8? Jennifer?
So on number 8, I had just a couple of questions. One specific to the charging port and then one specific to the agreement. And the question that I had regarding the agreement is whether or not the city should consider the possibility of purchasing the EV charging station rather than having it removed, and at least have that option in that agreement.
So we were privileged with the advance question from you. And we asked, I think Mark Teal, is Mark here? He's already
Right here.
there. All right, yeah.
He's ready.
Looked right by him. You're waving, and that figures. As my wife would say, it's right in front of you. Anyway, Mark is kind of prepped to answer that.
Great.
Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. Mark Teal with Municipal Services Operations. Also, Heather Price is here from the applicant, if you have questions regarding that as well. So your question is, I think, whether or not the city should have the ability to purchase the unit if the business were to go out, leave? Is that?
Correct,
Do I understand
yeah.
that correct? Okay. The short answer is yes, we would. I believe we could amend the agreement to include language to that. But after speaking with somebody today that has way more knowledge about electric charging stations and so forth, with the applicant, and then I also talked to Westar today to get a little more educated about this topic. And what I was told from the applicant is there's 3 different levels of charging stations. There's one for residential, like you would have in your garage. Then there's a medium level, and then there's a bigger commercial style charging station. This one is the medium size station, which I understand from Tesla, they provide for free to businesses if they want to install those. So if the city were to take ownership at some point, we would need to remove that particular station and purchase and install the type 3 or the bigger type station. This installation also requires the applicant to do it behind the meter, which means they pay, it's connected to their service and they'll pay for the electricity. If the city were to take ownership of the charging station, we would then have to install a meter, have it connected in line with one of our meters and rewire it. So there basically would have to be a start over installation anyway.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank
Okay.
you.
Is the charging station going to be universal, so any electric car can plug into it?
That's a good question, and I had to ask that myself when I talked to the applicant, because I was under the impression that Tesla is Tesla and the others are, but what I was told is that more and more applications and businesses are, or manufacturers are using a standardized connection, if you will, so it will be universal, is what I'm being told, to most of the electric charging vehicles.
Okay, thanks.
So the same cars that can plug in at like Westar on campus could plug in at this station?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, thanks. That's all the questions that I
Okay.
had around that.
Any other questions for Mark? Okay. Public comment?
You know, I think the universality of application is a pretty critical factor, and if you are so inclined, I'd suggest that maybe you add a caveat that says that it isn't a singular vehicle application, that it's designed for multiple applications as a condition. And that gives us direction so that we don't get out there and find that it's a singular vehicle application and not multiple.
I think that's a good idea.
I do too.
Okay. Anything else from staff or from the commission? Okay.
Thanks
Public-
for looking into that. I appreciate it.
Public comment. Come up, sign your name, tell us who you are. Got 3 minutes.
Courtney Shipley. I just had a kind of a question. I noticed in the memos that even though it will be a spot to charge, be a charging spot, that it wouldn't be a parking spot solely for people charging, so it would still be a free spot, like you're not losing a parking spot downtown. Did you guys want to say anything about that? That was interesting. Oh, like, what will the signage be? How will people understand that?
The answer to that is it will remain as it is today. It'll be a metered space parked for a fossil fuel vehicle or for electric charging. There'd be no change to the parking status there at all.
Thank you, Mark. Other public comment? Okay, back to the commission.
Will they be putting up a sign or anything indicating that it is free of charge or that it's an EV charging station or anything like that?
Heather, can you answer?
Please come to the microphone. Tell us who you are.
That would be an option if so requested, that we could do that, of course, with approval of the proper signage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just didn't know if you had plans to, or if it's just going to be the Tesla. Is the image on the item, the image?
I
of-
believe it is on the charging station, denoting that that's what it is. And I do believe that our architect is drawing out plans currently for our potential extension patio that includes the charging station within that one drawing.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anything else for the commission?
I would move that we authorize the city manager to execute the license agreement permitting Grinders, Kansas LLC, to install an electric vehicle charging station in the right-of-way in front of a property where they own a business located at 733 New Hampshire Street, with the caveat that they include language regarding universal plug-ins for electronic vehicle charging station.
Second.
I have a motion from Commissioner Nanda, second from Commissioner Herbert. All in favor? Aye. That's unanimous. Thank you. Okay, number 9, we've got Matthew.
Yes, I pulled that one just kind of in the spirit of transparency to recuse myself from that vote. On the list of properties, they have 11 properties listed. One of the properties listed I am no longer associated with, but for a period of about a decade I had a financial interest in. And I'm the most recent listed property manager on the city's rental registration site for that property, though I no longer own the property or have any financial interest in it. But it takes you about 10 seconds online to search my name and that address to have something come up. So just in the spirit of transparency, I'm going to recuse myself from this one.
Okay.
So
We'll call you back when you're ready. KT, you had something?
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is KT Walsh, and we had questions at the East Lawrence meeting last night about if, I know we have to remove trees because of the ash borer problem. We're wondering if low-income people, as this program advances, will have to have trees taken off their property at their cost. Is there a way to have it charged in increments on the water bill? It's hugely expensive to remove a tree. We just wondered if there's a way to make it affordable. Thank you.
KT, was there one of these trees that you were worried about, or is this a future issue?
Worried because it looks like the city's going to be going on private property now. So there was concern.
Okay, but was it concern with regard to one of the listed properties?
Not one of the listed
Just
ones, just where are
going
they
forward.
going
Okay.
next and how can we pay for it?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so Matthew has recused himself. We also have a question about the future, which does not actually involve this issue. I think we have an obligation to deal with these issues as they come up. KT has a decent point. It doesn't appear to be applicable to this, but it's something we should be considering. So,
Are we not gonna have Dave in his suit?
What I would suggest is that, under
Okay.
Commissioner comments, maybe you bring it up there as a separate motion of direction back to the staff to look
Okay.
into that.
okay.
Because this,
Sorry, I might jump in, Mayor, if I may.
Sure.
Just ask Katie for a point of clarification. Was the neighborhood association concerned about the emerald ash borer efforts or the Dutch elm disease efforts?
We thought it was emerald ash borer. Are we getting them mixed up?
Correct. So just for the record, since we're not at the mic, she did say emerald ash borer. This is actually a different program. A different part of the city code requires the removal of trees infected with Dutch elm disease. So these are not trees that are infected with emerald ash borer that we're aware of. They're not ash trees. And this is a long-standing program with the city. It's in those removal costs can be assessed to the tax bill to be repaid in, I believe, in looking at Sherry, city clerk. Is it 2 increments, Sherry?
We haven't assessed these because they've been removed and paid for. Last year, we
Okay.
did 3, and they were all removed by the homeowner and taken care of, so we didn't have to assess anything. Typically with other code enforcement issues like mowing and demolitions, it's just a one-time assessment on their tax bill. We don't spread it out.
Okay.
And I don't think we've done that differently on this.
Okay. And then specific to the emerald ash borer issue, the city, as far as I'm aware, Forestry Division is not enforcing any requirements on private property owners. That's simply a private property matter at this point.
Thank you, Brandon. So we need an arborist on our East Lawrence board, it looks like. And also, just historically, we were very lucky. They didn't think East Lawrence deserved elm trees when they planted them all over the city, so we don't have them. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that information, Brandon, Sherry. Okay. Public comment on this issue. Okay, back to the commission.
I think we're just supposed to receive this recommendation. Do we have to actually vote on it?
We have to require the removal of the trees at the owner's expense. I
Say it's
I
received.
think it's on us to say that it has to happen. And so,
But it authorizes me
Right.
to send the letters to those
Exactly.
property owners and then remove it if they don't.
Sounds good.
Hmm?
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess I would move to receive the recommendation from the Director of Parks and Recreation regarding the removal of dead elm trees on certain private properties and direct the city clerk to issue a notice to the owners of these properties requiring removal of the trees at the owner's expense pursuant to city code.
Second.
okay. Motion from Vice Mayor Larson, second from Commissioner Soden. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so that's that.
That was our opportunity
We'll
to bring
ask
the new
Matthew.
director today, but
Okay.
on everything.
You're paying for them, Matt.
Okay. We'll move on to public comment. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues except those scheduled on the consent agenda or regular agenda portions of the agenda after first being recognized by the mayor. Each person will be limited to 3 minutes for public comment. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss or debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they will refer the items to staff for follow-up if necessary. Individuals are asked to come to the microphone, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments and questions to the commission. General public comment. Okay, we'll move on to our regular agenda item, which is to receive the housing market analysis from BBC Research and Consulting.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. Diane Stoddard, Assistant City Manager. I thought I would just briefly introduce this item for you this evening. As you know, the housing market analysis has been something that's been underway most of this year. And Heidi Agler from BBC Consulting is here this evening, and she's going to recap the study for you. The study's now been completed. You may recall that she was in front of you in early June to provide some of the initial steps of the study, which has now been completed. And also, at the conclusion of her remarks and presentation, Shannon Oury, the chair of the Affordable Housing Advisory Board, is also here this evening, and they met yesterday and had the presentation from Heidi that you're about to receive, and also have passed on some recommendations to you, and she can comment on those and their discussion from yesterday. So with that, I would introduce Heidi.
Thank you, Diane.
Oh, great.
We're going to load this on the, use a PowerPoint because it's a little bit easier to see.
Diane, can we get the PowerPoint presentation updated on the agenda in the future?
Yes, we certainly can, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Oh, here we go. It doesn't show up as a PowerPoint there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for receiving this presentation this evening. I'm Heidi Agler. I'm going to talk about primary findings from our study. So you had a presentation from me in June, I believe, that gave some preliminary findings. I'm just going to give a recap on those, talk about some of the planning tools that the Affordable Housing Advisory Board has used to take this housing needs assessment forward. And those would include the dashboard, the roadmap, and then funding allocation. A bit about our study. We did a couple of different things. We called the first task assessment of Lawrence housing needs. It was more of the market analysis piece, so it looked at availability, supply of housing, affordability, and calculated unmet needs. We also did a tremendous amount of community engagement. That included a statistically significant survey of residents, including a lower income and student subsample, a survey of employers, a survey of landlords who provide a variety of rental units, focus groups with stakeholders, and then came up with recommendations in our action plan. So findings recap, I've put these into two different buckets. The first is home ownership affordability. We looked at the number of units that were affordable at different income brackets in your market and found that there aren't a lot. 72% of renters earn less than 80% of AMI by federal definition. These are low-income households. If we look at the units that were affordable to them, it was 41% of all units, and this would have been the first quarter of 2018. 70% of your condos were affordable to folks at 80% of AMI, 71% of townhomes, and just a little bit about a third of your single-family homes. When we project your housing prices forward 10 years based on your last 10 years of appreciation, we project that less than a third of the entire inventory will be affordable by 2028. And these are to low-income renters who like to buy. Based on our survey of residents, we estimate that between 2,000 and 3,000 renters earning between $35,000 and $75,000 a year are employed, are good candidates for ownership, and would like to buy. They have about 250 units to choose from right now. Those would be sold and listed units in 2018. Future affordability, if your housing prices increase at the same rate as they have over the last 10 years, your single-family for sale median will approach $375,000, townhomes $240,000, and condos $128,000. So really, when we think about the inventory that would be affordable to low-income households, it will primarily be condos, older condos, by 2028. We asked renters if they wanted to own, as you're aware, based on my last slide, and we took a look at those renters who would be good candidates for ownership. Just 11% of students said they'd like to own. The incomes of those who want to own are between $35,000 and $75,000 a year. That puts us in an affordability range about $110,000 to $262,000, given last year's interest rates. So if interest rates go up, as many think they will, then that price point will go down. These individuals are between the ages of 34 and 55. Most are employed full-time or part-time, typically don't have children, and have relatively small household sizes. So I would characterize them as your core workforce. We also asked individuals who were interested in moving a little bit about their situation, young adults and students, people who are in less stable housing situations or work situations, or those who told us they wanted to move. Individuals who said, I'm not interested in selling anytime in the future, were people between the ages of 45 and 54, and those with children. So those are the individuals who aren't likely to churn or move through their housing stock. For renters, we did something called a gaps analysis, which compares renters at different income levels with a supply of housing. We compared that between 2000 and 2016. We found, I'm going to move forward, it's a little easier to see here, that people who are earning less than $15,000 a year have a really hard time finding units in their market. They need units priced at $500 and less, and there just aren't a lot out there. In 2000, there was a greater proportion of units affordable to these individuals that were not publicly subsidized. So the private market was providing more affordable units. In 2000, the public sector is really the only game in town for people making less than $15,000 who are renters. These renters who have needs are mostly single, female heads of household, seniors, people with disabilities, and single mothers. The gap between the supply of units to reach your low-income households and demand is about 5,300 units.
I have
If
a
we-
question.
Yeah.
These households, the second bullet point having to do with 70% are female heads of household and all that, are you able to tell if they're multi-generational, like grandma's taking care of grandparents while the mother works or something like that?
That's a good question. We ask about household size and if children are living at home, but we don't get to more detail on composition. And I should note also, these numbers that on the second bullet, the proportions don't add up to 100% because there's crossover there.
Mhm. I was just surprised that 70% are female, but only 25% are single mothers. And that's
So-
what made me think there might be
Mhm.
multi-generational going on.
There likely are, and this would also represent seniors, so widows who are living alone and on fixed income. On the last bullet there, if we remove publicly subsidized housing, so the housing that your nonprofits and public housing authority provide from the gaps, your gaps would be much bigger. It would be 6,600 units that are needed to be able to not cost burden your lowest income households. So a summary of the housing needs and numbers. Again, there's some duplicative categories here, so the subset of renters there doesn't necessarily add up to that gap of 5,200. The renters who can't afford their current rentals, their cost burden, so it doesn't mean that they're homeless, but they're renting at higher price points than we'd like to see them rent, 5,200 households. Renters who want to buy would be candidates for home ownership. 2,000 is the low end there. The range is 2,000 to 3,000. Families experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, we believe that number to be about 700. That would include individuals as well. Households with disabilities with accessibility modification needs. This is based on our survey, so people with disabilities who told us their home does not have the modifications that they need to meet their disability, 500. Renters who told us their units are in fair or poor condition, it approaches 3,000 renters or 3,000 units. And owners with units in poor and fair condition, again based on our survey, 500. We look at the subset of these individuals, and this is all based on the survey. People in need, there are about 2,000 seniors, 1,500 persons with disabilities, 1,300 single mothers, and 1,000 students. Based on our student sample, we looked at students who have trouble affording their units or are living in units in poor condition. We also asked residents a series of questions on their opinions about housing types and housing needs in Lawrence. The next couple of slides summarize the primary findings there. The shaded area here shows the unit types that receive the most support. The residents said, these are unit types I'd like to see in my neighborhood. Those include medium single-family homes, so ranging between 1,500 and 3,000 square feet, townhomes and duplexes with similar densities to what you might see a single-family home, small lot single-family homes, units at less than 1,500 square feet, as well as medium lots. You'll see on the not appropriate in Lawrence column that there weren't a lot of people who said none of these housing types are appropriate in Lawrence. The highest proportion there is really is medium lot housing, so units between, lots between 6,000 to 10,000 square feet. Definitely these survey data show a movement away from large lots into modest density to be able to meet housing demand. We also asked that density question based on zip code or neighborhood that individuals identified with in the survey. And these series of graphics here show what people thought the appropriate home size would be for single-family homes as well as lots based on the zip code. I'll just draw your attention to the all residents column. If you look there at single-family home size, the way to interpret this is that 63% of residents said that an appropriate medium family home size, or that a medium size single family home would be appropriate for their neighborhood. Again, those numbers add up to more than 100% because there's some duplication there. With lot flexibility, most residents said, about half of residents said they'd support duplexes on the same lot size as single family homes. Similar 50% said they showed the same support for townhomes. We also asked that question about apartment buildings and emerging products. Apartment buildings, a little less support. That's not a surprise. This is typically what we see in most communities, but still a pretty large proportion of residents said they'd support apartment buildings. Most of that support was for smaller apartment buildings. The exception is zip code 66046, which showed support for larger sized apartment buildings. And then emerging products, we asked about what we know of as granny flats or accessory dwelling units, as well as tiny home communities. And between 1/3 to 40% of residents expressed support there. So we took all of that information, as well as a lot of other information that shows up in the study, and came up with some draft recommendations that the AHAB has reviewed over the last couple of meetings. Those include what we call a success dashboard. So we recommended that the city set goals, potentially in different affordability categories or attached with different solutions to monitor over the next 5 and 10 years. These are the goals that we presented to the AHAB yesterday for the cities and the AHAB's consideration going forward. We also took a little more of a deep dive with those goals and recommended potential tools or strategies, what we call a roadmap, to be able to meet those goals. And you see that detailed here in the right-hand column. And then last but not least, we took a shot at taking the trust fund dollars and demonstrating how those might be allocated. And the pie chart on the left shows if you were just to split those trust fund dollars equally among the different potential activities that could meet the housing needs, which we're recommending. It's what you see here. If the city were to adopt the goals, or some level of goals that we're recommending, and allocate the funding based on those goals, which is a closer match to what we believe your needs are, this is what the allocation would look like, potentially over the first 5 or 10 years.
Can you
I'd like to
verbally summarize the differences between the two pie charts? Because I can't read
Sure.
that text.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. So the first pie chart just divides into 6 slices of pie, the $1 million roughly that you get every year. And this doesn't include any supplemental or leverage dollars, CDBG or home, among the different types of activities. And that would include creation of new units, enhancing existing units, so making rehabilitation improvements to existing units that are in poor condition, providing financial assistance to owners and renters, so people who want to become owners, or people who are staying in their rental units. Addressing the subsidies that are set to expire, so units that are going to fall out of your affordability inventory. Increasing supportive housing programs, as well as enhancing homeless programs. So the first pie just divides the dollars among those 6 activities. The second pie rolls up the homeless programs, supportive housing programs, maintaining units that are set to expire, which are largely rentals, and creation of new rental units into one category, and allocates about 60% of the dollars available to that category. That's reflective of, when we think about where your needs are, the 5,200 rental units that are in there's your shortage here, that would reflect a more of a prioritization toward addressing those needs. The second highest category that dollars would be allocated to, if you follow this proportional allocation, would be financial assistance to people who want to become owners. So addressing those 2,000 to 3,000 renters who want to become owners. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Go ahead.
When you laid out the goals that the city should address, 2 of them that kind of stuck out to me as potentially counterproductive to one another. You had talked about that we need to have a goal of fixing up homes. Our current housing stock, there was some data there about the number of residents who say they live in a fair or poor condition home, but then also looking at expanding our current stock of affordable housing. Do you see those 2 as flying in the face of one another? In other words, as we move more aggressively towards increasing our housing stock condition, would that also necessarily increase the prices of those homes as they are fixed up?
You know, actually, I think there's more of it's a really good question. The units that are typically what happens, so a unit that is at risk of falling into disrepair, if you provide dollars right now to be able to bring that up to code or maintain that, the quality of that unit, it tends to remain, these are generally older units, smaller units that are probably naturally affordable. If we put dollars into the maintenance of those, they tend to stay relatively affordable, as opposed to a unit that would fall into disrepair, be torn down, and then have a new unit, a newer, nicer unit replaced on that lot. So what we're looking at is just the preservation of a unit that's naturally affordable. These dollars they don't go into cosmetic improvements or cause a unit to become, to move, I guess, up in terms of quality so significantly that it really boosts the price.
So really, you're just talking, when you talk about increasing a property to a condition outside of poor or fair, you're talking about from a safety standard?
Yeah, safety, basic maintenance. These are generally.
So how would that differ from the existing rental registration program that the city currently operates that has a series of safety conditions that property owners have to meet? Because it would seem, from my perspective, that this just kind of puts that onus on the city as opposed to the property manager, if we make it our personal priority.
These would be for both homeowners and renters, and generally we see the demand for these kinds of programs by people with disabilities or seniors who can't afford to make those improvements on their own.
Okay.
I can speak to our existing CDBG home-funded comp rehab program that has a limit of $25,000. So we're not just patching roofs. We might be doing a more comprehensive rehabilitation of basic systems of a house. It may be doing flooring and repairing structural damage, repairing things that just bring it up to a minimum standard. It's not, as Heidi says, it's not converting it from an affordable unit to something higher than that. It's really because it's not been repaired or a lot of TLC for a few decades that it needs to be more comprehensively rehabbed to bring it back up to a livable standard.
So if we're focused on those 500 properties that are owner occupied then, and not the 2,900 or whatever it was for rental properties that are currently addressed with the rental registration code, what would the city's role as you see it be in rehabilitating those 500 properties?
I mean, I view this as supplementing what you're already doing. And if you kind of look at the pie chart here in terms of this enhancing existing units, if you think about the prioritization based on the proportionate need, it's a smaller slice, obviously, on the right-hand side, because you do have an existing program, but it's helping address the condition needs that your current program doesn't have enough dollars to address. I mean, typically the condition, it's rare for a city to have no demand for any kind of condition or improvement program, because units age, people age and move into fixed incomes and don't have the ability to make those improvements. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
I have another question if you. One thing that I've been really interested in is us being a university community. You know, we have a lot of houses that were carved up into apartments, and I kind of imagine some of the smaller ones at least going back to perhaps single-family housing. Is that something that a city has tackled at all? Because of course, the value of that home is very different as a single family than having like 4 apartments or whatever. So has anyone actually tried to work on that?
You know, the only community that I'm aware of is Albany, New York, that has a lot of, not my understanding is, and I haven't been there, but I helped with a comprehensive plan there, or a code rewrite, a lot of non-conforming units. Mm-hmm. The problem with, and I think it's something that I would study a little more specifically in terms of what the displacement might be if you were to, because I do think that was a factor in Albany, and people felt like some of those units the repurposing of some of those units took some rental housing out of the stock. Now they had I think at the time, a high enough vacancy rate that they could absorb some of those units, but it did cause some disruption in the downtown core where those units existed.
I remember the units I lived in college, they would not pass code now.
Right, and generally, it requires quite a bit of rehabilitation to
Right.
convert those units back into a single-family home.
Is there any kind of easy term, vocabulary term for that kind of change? I mean, because it's not gentrification, but it kind of is in a weird way. Is there any, you called it repurposing, how would I label that?
You know, conversion is typically what you
Conversion.
see, and you usually see that when rental units are converted to condos. Some communities are looking at, so in high-cost communities, looking at as the millennial market moves into ownership, there is an opportunity to be able to for developers to convert the rental units into condos. And some communities are looking at attaching some type of affordability requirement to that conversion to ensure that some of those units at least stay affordable.
Yeah, I know that the Saddlehorn has done that, converted to condos. It's a very interesting but very complicated kind of factor when we talk about our housing quality. And yeah,
You know,
I don't know.
The other thing I would mention along those lines is high-cost areas like San Francisco, you're having residents ask for so in this situation where that type of unit would be converted into an ownership product or potentially a trust product, a first right of refusal. So the owners, you see this in mobile home parks a lot too, the current occupants would like the opportunity to be able to purchase that unit. So in San Mateo County in the San Francisco area, a lot of residents are asking for the county to intervene to be able to make those, at least have the option to be able to purchase those buildings before they get purchased by investors and then fall out of any kind of naturally affordable state.
Yeah, here, you know, if you have something that's 4 units, it could be worth $300,000 if you sell it as a rental with 4 units. But if you sell it as single family, it's $200,000. So that gap in $100,000, I don't know what the city or how the city could incentivize people to convert something back to single family.
You know, you could provide repair, like some kind of assistance with repairs, but you're right. I mean, when you take the present value of that income stream in a market like yours, it's more advantageous to rent a unit like that.
Right.
If your rental market softens and some of those units do become available, it might be appropriate
That's a
to
tough
look at some
fit
kind of intervention.
in our town. Okay, it's complicated.
You talked a little bit about density. Could you kind of get into that a little bit more as to how that would potentially help us with the housing situation?
Sure. You know, a couple of different ways, and I just want to be clear that a lot of times when I talk about density, I'm not sort of bringing like a Denver-style density into the conversation. We like to talk about appropriate density, and there's a lot of, and density doesn't necessarily mean 15 stories. It just means making better use of land. So there's a lot of different ways you could think about density to help address your affordable housing issues. You have a lot of large lots right now that, you know, particularly, I understand that you're a green community, and when we think about, does it make sense to maintain larger lots over time as water resources are more constrained, repurposing some of those lots to be able to add an attached unit that could be affordable, or that could add supply to your community. Density in terms of adding an additional, we're seeing a lot of density conversations around density bonuses. So if you allow a developer to exceed the density that they may have by right, so add an additional level to a development, then they would be required to give back in terms of deed-restricted affordable units. That's a very, very popular conversation right now in many high-cost cities. The caution with that is making sure that those units that would be created really are the units that would meet your need, so that you're not getting a lot of units that are studios or one-bedrooms that are renting just slightly under market, but units that are addressing a large range of needs. And last but not least, thinking about repurposing parking lots, both public and private parking lots, into, this is going on in Denver, the conversation around repurposing those to shared communities, so tiny home communities or cooperative housing, and also looking at better use of units. A lot of our housing stock in communities like yours was built during periods when we weren't really worried about land, not so much. And so you have a lot of inefficient use, and not you, just to point a finger at you, but our communities like yours have a lot of inefficient uses of land, just in terms of the way that units were developed. So you can think of maybe a building that was built in the 80s that has relatively generous one bedrooms, but may only be 2 stories on a really large lot. If those units were ever torn down and redeveloped, adding a story or just reconfiguring the lot in a way that adds a little more density and produces affordability.
Thank you.
That's when we were first elected, I think the first year or so, we had, I think that was the Diamond Heights subdivision where the neighbors were kind of fighting tooth and nail to having RS7, I think it was 7, RS7, into backing up to bigger lots, basically. They didn't, even though it was still a single-family zoning that they were wanting to put in, the developers, they didn't want those smaller lots. And it was very frustrating to try to deal with that, because do you remember that? Can you add detail to that I can't?
No, I think it was the RS7 and the RS5, which are pretty similar lots. But I think one of the things the study points out in terms of density, Heidi has a slide that shows where apartment buildings, for example, people think are appropriate in Lawrence, but not in their neighborhood, somewhere else. So we talk a lot about density and accessory dwelling units and all of the planning values that go with some of these concepts. But when the applications come in someone's backyard, it's often hard to, keep that value going, discussion going, and very quickly turns into a different discussion.
Yeah, how does the city incentivize, a West Lawrence, a new subdivision, to have smaller lot sizes?
Honestly, having good examples of that and how that can work is if you had the opportunity to build one, making sure that it works. And I'll bring in another example from Denver. Our Stapleton neighborhood, the lot sizes there, so it's the old airport that was redeveloped. It's tough to find a lot that's larger than 5,000 square feet there. My guess is that your average is 3,500. A number of those units have ADUs. It's a wildly popular neighborhood. And I believe that we're in a period, we as a country are in a period where people spend more time recreating and not necessarily working in their yards or taking care of their units. They're out and about in a community more and don't desire to have such a large lot. A lot of it depends on design, and one of the successful elements of Stapleton is the neighborhood has fabulous houses. They designed those really well, and people were willing to give up, or at least to take a risk, if you will, in occupying a unit with a smaller lot size for design. And I think that's key.
One thing you talked about with the tiny homes that I found, personally very interesting. But so I recently just became an insurance agent, and so I started looking at tiny homes and what kind of insurance do they require. And they're generally considered still mobile homes unless, of course, they're put on a solid foundation. And so you talked about having perhaps tiny home communities, which we have a few examples in our city, of course, but have you discovered any issues in other cities with people that didn't have it on a solid foundation and had troubles with insurance for it?
I have not explored the insurance question. Generally, it's more of a question of land use and code. Codes not allowing any kind of a tiny home community. Insurance issues are interesting in that, you can typically get, or sometimes get a foundation or a nonprofit. We see this with the public sector too, when source of income ordinances are passed, that the public sector will step up and put together a fund so that landlords are more comfortable in renting to, it's typically associated with people receiving Section 8 vouchers. So I feel like the insurance issue can be solved with, it's almost like a guarantor. And there's some movement toward that in the foundation and private sector community, but I don't know of that particularly attached to tiny homes.
I wanted to ask you about, you just talked about ADUs, and on page 30 of your report, you're quoted as, or the report is quoted as saying that prohibitions on accessory dwelling units negatively impact affordable housing. And I want to talk or ask you a little bit about that. One of the conversations that we're preparing to have coming up deals with owners of property using their property for things like Airbnb, short-term rental. And that oftentimes, that conversation includes accessory dwelling units where you have not only your own home, but perhaps a separate structure that you can use. How does that factor in when you talk about prohibitions on accessory dwellings negatively impacting affordable housing?
So in general, our opinion on ADUs is that they should be an option. A lot of communities, there's a lot of good examples out there of how communities have passed ordinances to ensure that ADUs do add positively, have a positive impact on the supply, and so they're not used just for vacation rentals and they don't lead to traffic issues. Typically what works in terms of an ADU is for affordability is if my understanding is that they're difficult to construct sometimes. They're hard to get funding for to construct. So if a city could provide some type of rehabilitation funding or streamline the permit process or approval process in exchange for some level of affordability. So you'd want to make sure if your intention with ADUs is purely to produce affordable units, you'd need to make sure that you're doing more than just allowing those to be built, that there's got to be some kind of give back from the provider. In Denver, the owner needs to live on site, which we're using that to regulate both ADUs and vacation rentals by owner. So there's some mechanisms that you can do to ensure that there's not only a proper maintenance on site, but also that unit is being given some level of affordability.
So for me, I just had kind of some reflections while looking at this as far as what I see the commission's role in moving forward on this, aside from relying on our affordable housing experts in the community to take this information and make responsible recommendations to the commission, is looking at simultaneously how do we work toward not having households where their income is $15,000 or less per year, which is kind of mind-blowing. How can we work toward that? Looking at the issues in regard to race that were included in the study, including the fact that Black and Asian renters were 2 times more likely to be displaced than white renters, as well as the fact that 68% of homeowners were white and 44% of homeowners were Black. And I think that those are issues that we can look at as well that aren't directly housing related, but peripherally, and part or representative of the larger issues that we've talked about. And then how do we change our policy to implement these recommendations? Each one of these smaller conversations that we've been having have policy implications, and how can we address those? And then how do we continue to move forward with public-private partnerships? And how do we be
Are these questions for Heidi?
strong parts of those? Yeah, so I was just wondering, in the recommendations that you make, I know that they're primarily toward practical movement toward those very concrete goals, but when you're looking at these broader issues, I think that that study very well pointed out, what are some of the recommendations that you would have about that, or what are some of the comments that you would have about those issues?
It's a really good question. So this is where the tension between addressing disproportionate housing needs and the Fair Housing Act comes into play. You recognize, as the study does, that there are disproportionate housing needs by race, ethnicity. I've talked a little bit about by disability and familial status, but you can't, other than building family-friendly developments or senior-only developments, restrict units for just certain people of races and ethnicities, because that would actually be discrimination, even if you're trying to solve some of those issues. So the best thing to do is make sure that when programs are available, that there's a lot of affirmative marketing, that you're reaching out to the individuals who you know have greater housing needs. And that's typically the best approach to being able to make those opportunities, to level the playing field, if you will, and particularly around home ownership. The other thing that I would just keep an eye on is lack of affirmative marketing by the private sector. So if you take a look at how many marketing firms advertise availability of units, it's the people who are in the ads or who appear on websites don't always represent the community. And so just, reminding and it may not be a blatant violation of the Fair Housing Act, but it certainly can feel a little exclusionary. So just being aware of that and reminding the private sector to keep inclusionary advertising in mind.
If you go back to the slide on the solutions, please. Are these solutions based on the funding that we have allocated for the Housing Trust Fund? I mean, are these doable with that funding, or will this require other resources as well?
This would require other resources. So if you take the first line here, stabilizing the rental gap, what we did is we took a shot at a reasonable proportion to be able to stabilize, and then in 5 years reduce what we project to be the rental gap in the future. 100 new affordable rental units could not be constructed solely with your housing trust fund. So this requires some kind of a leverage, which would be low-income housing tax credit, federal or state dollars that would, CDBG and home that would help build or help create those units, as well as a private sector contribution. So
are there details of the other required funds in your report?
Well, this is actually part of a larger spreadsheet that we provided to staff that has some information on our best estimate of costs, and then also discusses how these recommendations would be supplemented with the funding that you already have.
Okay. So do you have a ballpark on what it would take to do the short-term total amount of money?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, the two most costly, so if you look at 3, 4, and 5, those are programs that you already have in place, and that is just supplementing those programs. So those are not big ticket items, and those are very doable with the funds that you have. Allowing, and actually number 2, which is basically a down payment assistance program, but more, a down payment assistance program is only going to go as far as you have units for people to be able to buy. And so the idea behind that 100 goal would be using partnerships with the private sector, so density bonuses, streamline approval, potentially fee waivers to encourage them to be able to contribute more units, as well as, the one thing I wanted to caution you on is not thinking about, even though we put the dollars in those pie charts, that's not to say I wouldn't be that inflexible in how you allocate those dollars. If tomorrow somebody comes and says, look, I've got this condo development that I can't maintain anymore, if you help me out either with some a density bonus or bringing that into some kind of condition, I'd be happy to donate a certain proportion of those units to affordability. Some of those funds should be used for those kinds of things, and you may be able to get a bunch of units out of something like that. So that second piece, number 2 there, is not just purely down payment, and that would, it's hard to cost that out because that suggests a lot of private partnerships too. That's partially true of the first one too. You can apply some numbers. If it costs $150,000 an apartment unit to construct it, times 100, that gets you to some big numbers pretty fast, and obviously that requires federal funding or some kind of leverage. That would be true of any community. So no community that I'm aware of is solving all of these problems with their housing trust fund. They're doing it with private partnerships, including federal dollars.
Okay, thanks.
I'm curious, as you were collecting this data, your workings with the planning department and specifically code enforcement. I guess what strikes me is as I look at, what is this, section 3, page 4, where you break down the data of housing condition. I'm sorry to keep getting stuck on this,
Oh,
but
that's fine.
this was the part of the data to me that most stuck out. Specifically, let me just read a couple things. 38% of the group you categorize as renter large families rate their housing as poor. 1/3 of renters with children rate their housing as poor. 1/4 of all renters overall rate their housing as poor. We've had in this community a rental registration program for the better part of a decade, or coming on a decade. I guess I would ask you to speak to, do we have a disconnect between what we're looking for in a rental inspection and what a renter views as a poor condition? Do we have an ineffective rental registration program? Where's the disconnect? Because, I mean, when I see 38% of large families rating their rental property as poor, when we have a program that's been going on for a decade, that concerns me that pounding our head against the wall is not working.
You know, I don't know that it's a fault of your program necessarily. We didn't do any kind of program evaluation as much as, and if you didn't have that program, that number could be much higher. We don't know that because you have had this program in place. I think it's a good idea to have a rental inspection program like you do, a registration and inspection program. Otherwise, you have very little control unless there is, you know, a violation that's reported over maintaining that housing stock. We didn't all, and so that 38% is people self-reporting that. We just asked that question, poor or fair. We don't define it, and we don't get into a lot of detail about why did you say poor? What about your unit is causing you to define it as poor? So I don't think I have enough information to be able to say this is where a disconnect is happening. If anything, I think it's worth evaluating the rental registration program in the context of what people are telling us, and or telling us through the survey, telling you through the survey, and just making sure that that program is, you could use that data to target potentially some of the sampling and the examination of those units.
If I remember right, we just recently added the RM district to the rental. So even though the program may be 10 years old, it's only in the past couple of years that we've had RMs added to rental registry.
That's true. If I might interject, of course, that stood out to me too as the manager of that program. And so we started asking ourselves why that is. And I think there's a little bit of, when you ask the question about the quality of your home, you may be thinking of your carpet color or your carpet tears and things like that, or how old your appliances are. But two, as you know, our rental program looks simply at the life safety components of a structure. But we have examples where, because we only sample 10% of the units, sometimes only on a 6-year cycle, we're not in units in a real bold, aggressive way, and we're not in the majority or even close to the majority of units. And so there's a lot of units out there that don't get looked at by the city's program that may be popping up in the survey if they truly do have some life safety issues. So
why is that?
well, I don't know. I mean, the rental program.
Why isn't our program more aggressive?
Oh, well, our program was built out of compromise at the time it was built in terms of, you know, what we were going to get into, and we had to assume a lot of trust with landlords that they were taking care of their property. So it has led us to question that 10% sampling rule a little bit, to know whether or not that's the right percent of sampling and the right cycle, frankly. So if you fail your inspection with 5 violations, you're given a gold star, and you're said, we won't come back for 6 more years. Whereas if you fail with 6 or more violations, we'll be back in 3 years once you fix your violations. So, you know, some could argue that our rental inspection program, while it's doing some good work out there, because we've done a lot of good work with it, we give you reports on the violations every year, that kind of thing. Could it be more aggressive? Sure. But it needs to strike a balance.
When did RM get added?
That was, I don't know if Randy recalls the year. It was about 5 years ago,
Yeah, it
because
was
we're
13.
through our cycles now.
13
Yeah.
or 12, I think.
So like maybe halfway through the program, the 10 years is when
Well,
RM
No, the
got
cycle
added.
is-
So we've had rental programs since about 2001 in the RS district, or single-family districts. And then 2013, we expanded that to all districts citywide. And where the RS district, as I recall, was every unit every 3 years, the compromise at the time of bringing RM into the fray was all units get licensed, and we sample 10% of an owner's portfolio. And as you know, if we're not in every unit, we don't get to know if smoke alarms are in every unit. We know the ones we inspect, but we don't know the ones we don't inspect. And so I'm wondering, because we have knowledge that because we also are complaint-based. So we do have to, on occasion, go into other units that weren't part of the inspection cycle and cite for violations as well. Same owner, different unit, didn't get inspected, we go in and cite for that. So.
You have the least aggressive program that I've worked with, and I think that you have a very successful lobby that has lobbied the legislature in this state to control the intrusion that they would argue that this program contains, and I think the numbers reflect that. I think it'd be interesting to see what this number would look like if you would compare it to other places that have what I consider to be a more normalized inspection program.
One of my concerns is of the substandard housing that we may have in apartment buildings, that when we go to aggressively enforce those, it turns into harassment of basically low-income people needing to find another place to live. And I mean, do you have any ideas on how to balance that?
It's tough. There's a lawsuit a fair housing lawsuit in St. Paul, Minnesota, I think, around that issue, that their code enforcement disproportionately impacted low-income and immigrants.
Right.
And people don't want to be inspected constantly. There's a lot of federal inspection that has to take place. So just being, having good inspectors, having bilingual inspectors helps too. If you have a lot of lower income renters who are Spanish speakers primarily, and providing advance notification. There's not a lot that you can do about it other than be real gentle in how you inspect the properties, because the correlation is that lower income units are probably the units that are in the worst condition, particularly if they're not publicly subsidized, or obviously they're not publicly subsidized. And people who do, there are certain people in your community, in every community, that need to occupy units that are in substandard condition because others will not rent to them, typically because of criminal history or poor credit history.
Right.
So I would just say it's a correlation, the condition and the very low income units.
Right.
There's not a lot you can do about other than just make sure you're not too aggressive in the way that your inspectors are not too aggressive or intimidating.
Yeah.
So on your short-term goal, the number one item was 100 new affordable rental units. Did you explore the idea of buying up existing stock of housing and rehabbing that housing as part of it?
Sure. I mean, this would include all different types of strategies. So really I wouldn't take this as overly prescriptive. What we're doing is setting aspirational goals, saying it would be great if you could add 100 rental units to your stock. That would be fantastic. You can do that in a number of different ways. And let's say that Ben Carson issues an RFP tomorrow for communities, a grant opportunity where you could get $5 million and you win. Then move those trust funds into some kind of a leverage. There's always a match with federal grants. So it's just being flexible in terms of, there's a lot of different strategies you could use, including redeveloping underutilized land, parking lots, for example, to be able to try and hit that goal.
So it's not necessarily new rental units?
It could be it should be, actually. I wouldn't focus just on new construction. It can be a lot of different strategies.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems our new construction is focused on the top of that AMI range, that even though it may be below, it's still well at the top of that range.
It's very expensive to build right now in the country because of shortage of labor, and a lot of the commodities that create multifamily housing are very costly right now, steel and cement in particular.
Lumber.
So I've been trying to think of how to reframe my question. Because I think that the perception was that I was talking specifically about racial disparity, but I think I'm more talking toward affordable housing is one piece of how you raise a community, their standard of living, et cetera. So even in the report, there was indication of racial disparity, obviously issues with poverty, the fact that our policy prohibits in some ways some affordable housing options for some folks, and that we have room to grow in regard to public-private partnerships and things like that. And so in your experience in doing this, how do we have basically a multimodal approach to addressing issues with housing and mental health and homelessness? And, you know, there are just so many things, and when we silo them and focus specifically on one thing, great things can happen. But if we're not also addressing these other peripheral or symptomatic issues that are causing the need in the first place, we're not going to be ultimately successful. We're not going to make ourselves obsolete, essentially, which I believe is our goal on the issues like this. So how have you seen communities doing this well? And how have you, have you seen any communities kind of taking a broader approach on these issues?
Communities are starting to. So really what you're saying is just breaking down the silos and recognizing that housing is a component of health and vice versa, and that there's a lot of institutional barriers that have led to the inequity that we have, and breaking down those barriers requires a lot of cooperation, a lot of cross-departmental cooperation. I give a lot of presentations just trying to get people to that place, so the fact that you all are having the dialogue about this and have for a while is exceptional. Honestly, it's keeping, it's very natural for departments to set goals or to have initiatives and focus on those, because it's what they do, it's what they know, and it's what they're tasked with. And so just keeping the dialogue open and making sure that you have a very, in my observation, tight-knit and close and functional nonprofit community that's thinking about these issues too. So making sure the dialogue's there, that we're reminding folks of these connections all the time, and then ensuring, at the very basic level in terms of helping to break the cycle of poverty, that you've got quality education and that that all children have access to opportunity and what they need, and that can take a variety of forms. But I think acknowledging that and keeping the dialogue open and making sure that that people understand that inequity takes place for a lot of different reasons and needs to be addressed through a number of mechanisms is the right thing to do. For a long time, we thought if we just built housing and put people in it, that would be enough, and clearly it's not.
Thank you.
I know, Commissioner, that you're speaking about silos, and I can understand I can relate to that, because I know I've been doing a little bit of work on the community health plan with the health department, and they're looking at that same issue. How do we get all these organizations so we don't have these silos and we can address the issue? But we've got our CIT program, which was talked about earlier, to deal with some of the mental health issues in the law enforcement. We've got, obviously, we're working on this housing situation very hard. And when I look at the community health program, it seems like the components are there, but are we talking to each other enough to actually make the progress that we need to make to kind of break down those barriers? So.
Thanks.
Other questions for Heidi?
What's the roadmap for you in the future? Is this your final exit?
Oh, from Lawrence?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Well, I don't know, I'd love to come back. I think you have a great city. I hope to come back at some point and see how you're doing and whether or not this worked. But yeah, this would be my final obligation as part of this study.
I appreciate your help.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Good work.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm going to exit out of this so I can take my jump drive. Bear with me a moment.
Shannon?
So I'm Shannon Oury. I'm the chair of the Affordable Housing Advisory Board and the executive director of the Housing Authority. We received this presentation yesterday also, and are very pleased at how the analysis has come out. I think we've been working on it for years, and we all knew there was a gap, but nobody knew exactly how big the issue was that we needed to address. And so one of the things from the board's perspective is that at least we understand it's a point in time and it's that snapshot, but it at least gives us some parameters to be working through. So the board has specifically accepted the housing market analysis and recommended its adoption to the City Commission. I will say with the caveat that the specific goals and the dashboard is something that we have not spent a lot of time working on. It was something that we asked BBC to sort of prepare for us, but it is something between this document and the information we've been given by BBC, and also the work that the staff is helping us with on the toolkit. It's our intent to bring back to you a more refined sort of dashboard, maybe how we're going to try to accomplish some of those things. And then also the final piece of that work would be the creation of a matrix on how we're going to evaluate RFPs and proposals that are brought to us, and what we're specifically going to be looking for. I think the only other comment I have is that we're very happy about how comprehensive it is between ownership and rental and subsets of both of those groups, including accessibility features and you know, making different properties more energy efficient, and sort of the broad look at whatever solutions that we could possibly come up with to address this issue.
Thank you. Questions for Shannon?
I'm curious, she was showing the pie charts, and one was basically equality of all of the dollars to the whole pie, and then the other pie chart had to do with perhaps consolidating our priorities for a certain subset. Is that something that is a policy decision that the City Commission needs to make in terms of prioritizing what groups? Or is that something that the board, the Affordable Housing Advisory Board, should prioritize themselves?
Yeah, and our discussion around that was a good representative of sort of options, but that is not something that we are specifically recommending to adopt one or the other of those. I do think, I mean, it is certainly your purview to decide how you want us to spend these funds and what you prioritize. That is bounded by the applications we receive. Mm-hmm. And so I think from the advisory board's perspective, we want to try to be as open as possible, because we don't actually know what we're going to receive. And so if some years the only sort of applications we get are in one category, but maybe they can bring on a lot of units, that may be something we want to consider, versus other years where we have a lot of proposals, then trying to make those hard decisions about how do you divide the money up.
It sounds like from when I was asking, about the cost of new construction generally is going to the top of, like, you're still under, that AMI, but you're still at the top of that range. And that if there's a way that we can somehow more aggressively pursue new construction, even having to do with the bottom of that range.
Yeah, and just from a historical perspective, so the Housing Authority, with the City Commission's approval, purchased back in 2006 Clinton Place, which is 58 units. We bought it for a little over $1 million. To get it habitable again, we put another $1 million in it. So 58 units that were already built that required purchase and then rehab was $2 million, which of course, is it's 2 years of the entire fund that we're talking about. The Housing Authority is currently looking at building 10 units by the proposed behavioral health crisis center complex. And we anticipate that'll be 1.5 million or more. And so that's 10 units. So that at least sort of gives you the perspective of what it costs to do either one of those two things. Take existing units and either bring them back up to a habitable, buy them and bring them back up, and or build something new. It's very expensive.
But even at $2 million for 58 units, that's only $35,000
A unit.
Yeah.
So that's actually,
It was, and the reason it happened that way was it was a HUD-funded project, and the city and the Housing Authority got the first right of refusal, right? So
Yeah.
the landlord, the owners didn't get to go sell it out on the open market.
Yeah.
Because of the loan, we got to basically opt in.
yeah, so that's still good money. I mean, good,
It's,
yeah, that was great.
It's great. It's been a great investment
Yes.
for affordable housing.
Other questions for Shannon? Okay, thank you.
I guess I do have a question. I'm sorry, Shannon. I forgot, I was asking about the multi-generational question having to do with demographics. Do you see anything in terms of kind of, I don't want to say average families, but do you see a lot of multi-generational families now?
I will say that we have quite a few grandmothers raising grandchildren. So sometimes there's a missing generation in there. And I can also support the numbers about how many single head of households we have, both in our single moms, single women, and single seniors. Our numbers track almost exactly what this report has.
You didn't coordinate on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, public comment on this issue.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, Commissioners. My name's Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement. And, I can see there is a need for affordable housing. And this assessment study is probably going to be up for discussion for a while. And I think that it's going to pertain to neighborhoods, neighborhood by neighborhood. And, I see that this was done by zip code 66044. Well, what we'd like to know is, what is it, the 6644 on that side of the river, the north side of the river, or was it on this side of the river? And, North Lawrence, 75% of the homes over there are owner occupied. 25% is rental property. And, we have a lot of, we encourage, matter of fact, we're going to have 7 more Habitat homes built on the 800 block of Walnut. And, we encourage that. We got 6 new homes built on the corner of 6th and Perry since the pump has been put in. So this thing, though, I've fought this, we fought this RS5 and RS3 zoning, high density type thing. And I've said this before, when the RS5 zoning first came in, about jamming people together, and we called it ghetto zoning. The more you start stacking people on top of each other, and you take the rural atmosphere out of North Lawrence, we're about stacked out. And the stormwater, I'm sure this consulting firm knows nothing about the stormwater problems that we have in North Lawrence. Just because we got a $7 million pump put in there 3 years ago, the only thing that did was brought us up to speed with the existing housing that we have. It wasn't built for new development. And so this is something that Yeah, it seems like a pretty good plan, you know what I mean? But each neighborhood, whether it's North Lawrence, East Lawrence, Pinckney, whatever, they're gonna have to tweak it to their own neighborhood. Or, you know, if you come in to North Lawrence and start jamming houses on 25-foot lots, like you did here about a year and a half ago, that ain't gonna get it. We need that green space. We needed that green space to percolate the water into the ground instead of spending $7 million on a pump. Everything has to be pumped out of North Lawrence. That's never gonna change. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Other public comment?
Katie Welsh, Neighborhood People, coming to the mic. I just wanted to remind you that in the East Lawrence neighborhood, which is part of the original town site, most of the lots are just 50-foot wide. So our neighborhood is and has been living in a healthy density, you know, the kind of goal we're working towards in the city because of the original platting of the city in the 1800s. We also have 17 historic shotgun houses, which is a style where you can shoot a shotgun through the front door or back door. It's basically 2 rooms and an added bathroom. And these 17 qualify as tiny houses and are working well. They were built by black families who came up from the south in the late 1800s and are still existing. So I just wanted to bring that up. I also just returned from Minnesota, and they, in St. Paul, which is interesting that you mentioned that, they have just built a low-income housing in their downtown, senior housing, and on the ground floor they put retail for minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses who have a tough time getting the rent in a downtown situation. And what they used was their community land trust. So the community land trust owns the land underneath, and then they use the typical incentives and funding to get the housing and the retail. So I'm bringing this up because we always want our land trust to work downtown, bring housing downtown, be part of all these developments. But also as we go into our downtown master plan and we look at how mom and pop stores can't rent downtown because of the high rents, and it's really hard to start a business near downtown, it's just something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Rebecca Buford, Executive Director of the Lawrence Community Housing Trust. And Katie, I didn't make you say that. But it reminded me that I do want to speak to you. Thank you, commissioners, for your leadership in affordable housing. I really do think Heidi was able to share with us that we are doing well in a lot of fronts. And she has a national perspective, and I always feel that too. We're the only community housing trust in the state of Kansas and a large majority of the Midwest. So we have some tools here that are best practices across the country, and we need to remind ourselves of that. We're that far along. And this study is really going to help us put light on what we've known to be true, but gives us some numbers. And I think the most important thing that I want you to take away from that is to know that we do have the nonprofits and for-profit partners available to do some really progressive and interesting and creative things. So we have to keep having these discussions, and we don't have to completely reinvent the wheel, just maybe re-envision that a little bit. And I couldn't agree with Ted, Mr. Boyle, more in the fact that we need to talk to the neighborhoods. We need to bring all these partners to the table to make things work, so that it's not a we're forcing this down your throat or we're going to demand this. But I think we can fit things in that really work well in every neighborhood to have little bits of affordable housing in each neighborhood in different styles and different formats and different types of housing. And that takes some creativity and some cooperation and some effort on compromise as well. And we ask the city and commissioners that we take advantage of, okay, this might not fit in this box, but gosh, it's a great idea for affordable housing. Let's give it a try and be brave in taking down some of the bureaucracy that sometimes makes creativity hard. I know it needs to be there, but it seems like the best communities that are doing this well have taken a little creativity and used some interesting ways to do this well. And then I ask you to consider permanently affordable. So if we're putting public dollars into something, we really demand that there's a return on that. And that means on for-profit partnerships as well, that they can get something out of this, perhaps a partnership with a nonprofit who can bring money to the table. As Heidi said, our housing trust is not going to finance everything. We need to leverage that. We have done low-income housing tax credits, all sorts of leveraging in this community. We just need to do more of that. So we have the ability. Let's now take the creativity and partnerships to the next level and really increase our capacity. I know we can do it, and I look forward to your leadership on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Other public comment? Okay. Back to the commission. Our item is to receive and adopt the housing market analysis, if appropriate.
One thing I'd ask is that as we go forward with this, this certainly doesn't affect our decision tonight to receive it. I think we're going to receive it. But as we move forward, Commissioner Ananda's comments about, siloing of the issue, one of the things that I'd like us to remember is that there are multiple parts to creating affordable housing, and that oftentimes when we make a decision to improve one aspect of that, we need to be very aware of the resulting effects of that. The fable of being so hungry that you chew off your hand, and that ultimately that your action may fix your immediate need, but creates perhaps a greater problem. And as we make decisions up here, these decisions, we say out of one side of our mouth that we need to make sure we're promoting affordable housing in the community, but that also is going to entail us making a commitment to holding steady on things like property taxes. Because as we increase property taxes, the resulting effect is going to be property owners increasing rents on their properties. Things like, as we talk about aggressive programs to improve housing conditions, these can absolutely solve problems with, 41% of survey respondents talking about the condition of their property being poor. But as aggressive programs are put towards housing improvement and the housing condition improves, and thereby the demand to rent that house increases, you see the resulting effect of increasing rents. I think one of the big variables that we're always going to be fighting against was mentioned in this survey where they said 52% of landlords report that their properties rent in 1 week or less. The demand is huge. The demand will always be huge. Unless you intend to move KU out of Lawrence, Kansas, you are going to have 20,000 people living off campus every single year. That demand will never go away so long as the university doesn't go away. And therefore, what you can control is not the demand, but you can control the cost by looking at variables that we do have the ability to control. Variables like property tax, variables like this aggressive housing condition, and things of that nature. So I just encourage us to think about that in decisions we make going forward.
I think one thing that Rebecca mentioned that we do always need to make sure we remember is that we're looking at permanent affordable housing. A lot of housing has been added downtown and even in East Lawrence, but the affordability is only for 10 or 15 years or whatever. We need to remember, if we want to have a lasting impact, that permanently affordable housing needs to be the priority.
I agree with that 100%. I think we need to look at that for sure. Well, I'm anxious to kind of see what the housing board does with this affordable housing board as they move forward with their meetings to come up with some more specific goals and the recommendations that they'll make to to us, and so I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said a lot of what my reflections were on looking at this and my expectations moving forward. Identifying what our role is in this, I think, is to be that group that prevents that siloing or that helps increase that communication from everything that Matthew mentioned to what Leslie mentioned to talking about how do we get these folks talking. Or how do we serve as the folks who are looking broadly at all of those things as we make these decisions? So I really appreciate and look forward to, looking at those concrete steps as well. So we can be up here in the theoretical all we want, but we really have to do things to make things happen.
I would like to celebrate one of the partnerships, but I don't have the information at my fingertips. There was a contribution to help pay for this study, I believe. Can someone help me out with the details of that?
The Board of Realtors supported the study at the $20,000 level, so we certainly want to recognize and thank them for helping the city with it.
That's a really positive step on the part of the Board of Realtors, and we really do appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a demonstration of one of those partnerships that's important to this as we go forward. I'd like to echo the goal that we have of permanent affordable housing. We need to focus on that. There's another aspect that's important to me. I think it's important to all of us, and that is permanent dispersed affordable housing. We need this throughout our community, not just concentrating affordable housing in one or two sections of town. And I agree with the neighborhood folks. We appreciate your comments tonight. You're one of our partners that's important too. It takes the community to rally around this. And I think that there's been a lot of good work that's been done. And I think the community does support this goal of permanent dispersed affordable housing. And we just need to keep that in our minds, that that's where we are headed. And I'm very happy that we have this information. I think it's in a good format. I think it will be something that we can use and refer to. So I'm very happy tonight. I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. And I think it's another step. So thank you all. I'd entertain a motion if someone would.
Move we adopt the housing market study.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Vice Mayor Larson. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It's unanimous. Okay. So we'll go on to commission items. Go ahead,
I've got
Matthew.
one. I met with Kate Michi at the Lawrence Humane Society, and I think she had met with several other members of the commission as well. They have, I believe, sent to either Tony or Maria their list of changes to kind of modernize the animal code within our community, and they had asked that I bring up this evening kind of a formal request to get that placed on an agenda somewhere and move that forward. So
Maybe we get some information from staff on that at some point.
This is, I think, as I recall, this is their suggestion, which the staff is reviewing, and
Okay.
so it's nice that they're going to the commission while we're trying to negotiate those things out.
Yeah, I guess one of the questions was timetable. Do we have a timetable for this?
No, I don't think we do at this point. We'll give you, next manager's report, I'll update you.
Okay. Matthew, does that provide the accommodation that you are interested in on that commission?
Yo, I'm just passing along.
Okay.
I'm a little more than a mouthpiece.
Okay. Other commission items?
So I know that Lisa and this might be more of a calendar item. I can wait until we talk about the calendar.
Okay.
Never
Let's-
mind.
yeah, Okay. We had a conversation earlier this evening about trees. I'm not sure if this is something that we needed to talk about in commission
Sounded like
items.
it got resolved.
I think
on
it got
the fly.
resolved,
Yeah.
but, you know,
We'll talk more about it amongst the staff, and if
Okay.
there's more information that we think needs to be provided, we'll
Okay.
give it to you.
it just seems like there's a magnitude of difference between mowing the lot and dealing with a tree, so.
I don't have the information on the costs that have been on there previously.
Yeah,
I think the
okay.
clarification was that this is something we've been doing. This is the elm trees, not the emerald ash borer, which is a totally different program.
Right, but I'm just saying if we have to take a tree down, it's a whole
Oh, in
different
terms of the
magnitude of
cost,
cost
right.
than it is for mowing a lot, so.
And if we're not doing emerald ash borer today, that doesn't mean we're not
We're gonna be doing it, yeah,
tomorrow.
we're
I
gonna
can
be
tell
doing
you,
it.
as that thing moved from the Great Lakes area and it kind of followed me all the way to Kansas through Iowa,
Yeah.
I
Thanks
would
for
tell
that.
you that, yeah, we were into private properties.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I mean, and you have to be because they become a dangerous
Yeah.
element, not just to the property, but sometimes falling into the public right-of-way as well. So we're gonna, I suspect we'll be right there too. Some of the treatments and things have advanced, and, you know, you'd like to think that maybe that would stave off some of it, but I'm not sure that that's really being applied on a lot of the private property.
I do know the program that we implemented, or with Parks and Recs is implementing, includes looking at some of the private property trees for the borer, emerald ash borer.
Yeah.
So,
We'll try and give you a little update.
I wanted to see if the commissioners had thought any further about the city commission having input on the body camera policy.
Do you have any idea of like the amount of input, like we actually,
That's up to us.
okay.
What
Did
kind
you
of
have-
input
did
do
you
you
have
want to
some i-
have?
Did you have some ideas?
I want to hear your ideas. It seems like I'm the one that's pushing that we even talk about it, so I would like to hear
Well,
your
my
all's ideas.
assumption was it's going to come back for us to review, in that there would be some, we would be allowed to comment on it. Is that, Tom?
Yeah, first off, I think sometimes we get into conversations and we use terminology that may not always be specifically appropriate. And really what, I think a larger part of what the police department is putting together are procedures, not necessarily the policies. Now, they take the effect of a departmental policy and how they're applied, but a lot of the material that would be covered by this is what they do in given circumstances and the training associated with that and where they wear it on their body so that it doesn't get confused with the other weapon that they're carrying. And so there's procedural matters that are really not policy matters that would move to the level of the city commission. However, some time ago, I think this very conversation took place, not just the last meeting when Commissioner Soden raised it. And I indicated that I would bring back the policy to you.
That's what I thought, yeah.
And you would see it. But understand that it doesn't necessarily, and I don't think you should think that you would want to necessarily change procedural matters, because quite frankly, that's the authority of the police chief in administering and developing those specific procedures. That doesn't mean we aren't willing to share that with you and show it to you and allow comment on it and consider that comment in the, you know, the final draft of those. But we have a lot of persons that are working on that policy that are technically almost expert in that. And it also has to go through the Justice Department, and has been, and that's partly part of the delay. And now we're rolling out different equipment. That equipment may actually derive to a specific part of the policy or procedure development that we roll into this document. But when this is ready for prime time, we'll certainly bring it to you, and I think that was my commitment to you a long time ago when we had that earlier conversation.
Well, I think it's also important to realize that this isn't happening in a vacuum. We're working on the Community Police Review Board. We're in discussions, as I understand it, on the disproportionate minority contact study. So I think these things are working together to improve our community relations and actually the efforts of the police force.
I would agree with that. I think that you're going to be seeing the DMC intergovernmental agreement shortly in the next 2 meetings. And then that overlays the actual agreement between the county and I think it's Northeastern University in Boston, which will be actually undertaking this study. I will tell you that your city staff was heavily involved in the rewrite of the agreement from what was originally presented, because we felt that it needed a lot more commentary and process than what existed in the initial drafts. And that's being as gentle as I can be about that.
But one other thing on the body cam policy, I'm frankly not that well informed on the parameters of state law. And I think that has an impact on the policy as well. I don't think that's something we've really talked about. So I mean, I've got a lot to learn on this before I start saying, well, I think it ought to be this or ought to be that.
Well, and I think the other thing that would be beneficial for you is to see the equipment maybe that we're using. We'll do a demonstration so you can see it and the replay. There's the procedural issues that the police deal with in the actual application of the use of the tool live on the street. And then there's a big part of procedural issues that relate to the retrieval and availability of the taped information and how long we hold on to that and who has access to that. And you get into some constitutional right issues and you get into then state statutory issues. And so we'll lay that all out for you. At the end of the day, I suspect that you'll be wondering how much you do want to comment about that, because again, this is an authority responsibility issue as to who has the authority to administer this, to impose this both procedure and policy, and then also who is responsible for it to make sure that it's meted out correctly, that it's evaluated, that it's reviewed, and that it's updated.
Thank you.
Other commission items? Okay. City manager's report.
Yes, thank you. Usually I don't have a report on during the work session meeting, but this is kind of a hybrid meeting, I guess is the way I describe it. The first thing I wanted to do, though, was introduce Christopher Lutz Cannon. And if you just stand and wave, and if Kurt would make sure he's on camera so everybody sees who this gentleman is. First off, Christopher is a resident here in Lawrence with his family. He is, I think, retired military, but maybe still has some connection lingering. Retiring, okay. He is joining us as an International City Manager Association Military Veterans Fellow, which was a lot. What that means is Christopher will be attached to us through December 21st, and he'll be shadowing me and sometimes you, Mayor, maybe you, Vice Mayor, on different issues that we deal with, but he will also be undertaking special projects, which we have not yet determined. So he's kind of in an internship program, a mentoring program, and a shadowing program to really decide, if this is, where he wishes to transition to. As I said, this is a kind of a joint effort of the military and our International City Managers Association to bring individuals, that are in the process of their retirement from the military into maybe their next career in life. And we're anxious to work with Christopher. We've already seen some rather superb analytical abilities that he has been trained in, and which probably we're hopeful will rub off on some of us in the process as well. We usually get at least equal, if not more, out of these programs. And by the way, I won't say there isn't a cost, because there is a cost associated with it, but we're not paying for it at the local level. So we're getting a lot of effort and probably a lot of education about how the federal government works on different issues as well during this whole process. So I just wanted to welcome Christopher to our team and make sure that you understood that you'll be seeing him around a little bit more.
Great. Welcome.
Welcome.
The other issue that I wanted to mention is you received late some comprehensive information about Hetrick Air Services, which serves as our fixed-base operator at the airport. Fixed-based operators at the airport typically are the service providers. They'll be the vendor for fuel and maybe mechanical services and maybe some hangar rental and maybe some assistance in terms of, moving people around when they come into the community and things of that sort. And Hetrick has been our fixed-based operator for some time. Wanted to inform the commission about a time-sensitive request from Hetrick Air Services, which provides, like I said, the FBO services at our airport. Lloyd Hetrick, is Lloyd in the audience? Lloyd's right in the back row. He's informed city staff that he is considering making significant financial investments to construct a new aircraft hangar and open 2 new aircraft sales and service centers at the airport. His initiatives may also receive grant funding from the Kansas Department of Commerce, where he's been talking to them. Mr. Hetrick desires to extend his current premises lease and the fixed-base operator agreement and lease additional land for construction of a new aircraft hangar. He has let us know that these business development opportunities are very time-sensitive. And that means, time-sensitive in this case means that he has a window of opportunity that is open for a period of time, and then that opportunity will move someplace else to consider another location, as I understand it. He's requested the city expedite its consideration of his request. Earlier today, we uploaded a memo to tonight's agenda under the city manager report. The memo explains the request, and it provides an update on conversations about this request. As background, the city owns the airport under the under the FBO agreement, Hetrick provides FBO services. The current agreement is dated January 12th, 1999. It established an initial 5-year lease with options to renew the agreement for 4 additional 5-year terms. This 25-year agreement is entering its last 5-year extension period and will expire in year 2023. So their lease is not expiring. They still have 5 years on their lease. Hetrick has requested an expedited negotiation process for a 30-year lease, this 5 years plus a 25, and an FBO agreement. Logically, he is hesitant to invest significant capital in new facilities, operations, and inventory when only 5 years remain on his lease agreement. Until just a few weeks ago, city staff was not anticipating negotiating a new FBO agreement this year, since there are still 5 years left under the current agreement. The current agreement is 20 years old and needs to be revisited. A 30-year commitment of city facilities and FBO services should be evaluated to determine the city's long-range goals for the development and operation of the airport. I've actually given direction now to staff to prioritize this effort and return to the commission at the earliest possible date with a recommendation. Looking at schedules and need to negotiate a new agreement, this likely won't return until the first part of October. Mr. Hedrick is present this evening, and he may want to add comment. One thing I do want to correct the record on about an issue is if you looked at the timeline said that we received a report submitted by Mr. Hedrick, and that letter that we asked for to update the situation was dated August 29th. Actually, we didn't ask for that letter until August 31st. We didn't receive it until September 7th. Okay, and that is not eminently clear by just reading that particular timetable item. But I wanted you to understand that the dates don't necessarily match up with our knowledge of when this was all, coming about. Now, that letter was sent, and the letter, as I understand it, was sent initially to the chamber. The chamber was reviewing it because they've been assisting Mr. Hedrick in how to approach this issue. But I didn't want anybody to get the impression that we sat idle for that period of time. The 7th is the date we've actually received that letter. So just so you understand that going forward, because sometimes when you see things like that, people make assumptions about, that we might have been sitting on those things, and we weren't sitting on that. Having said that, I wouldn't call this a gift horse, but I don't like to pass up opportunities, especially because we know, just since I've been here, that we've looked at different opportunities for the airport that have not materialized. And this looks to be a very solid proposal for expansion and improvements at the airport. Typically, I would come to you and I would say that we should do an RFP and a competitive process. I need to be further assured that we don't have time to do that, because that obviously would push this process out. But having said that, and yielding to the time pressures that are sensitive to Mr. Hedrick and then by extension to us, it seems to me that that should weigh in our favor in terms of the terms and conditions that we should be able to negotiate for the benefit of the airport and the city in that regard. So we will take a look at this, and we will try to give you the best advice we can, recognizing the risk of pushing this off to just a competitive process and the likelihood that we could lose, the proposals and the investment that might be lost in that process. So I wanted to update you. You do not have to make any decisions about this, obviously, at this point, but I wanted to let you know that we're under some pressure based on these time constraints that have been delivered to us to sit down and have a discussion quickly and seriously about whether we think we can actually reach some sort of reasonable understandings and try to assemble some comparisons to make sure that we're not giving the store away. Any questions? Or would you like to hear from Mr. Hedrick as well?
We have public comment for the city manager's report.
Okay. That's the only thing I had on the report.
Yeah, thank you. So public comment on the city manager's report.
Lloyd Hedrick. I might just reiterate that these opportunities have come about in the last 60, 90 days. I've been at this for 35 years here, and I've seen a lot of opportunities come and go, and I just hate to see us lose this. The primary one, there are several opportunities basically on the way of aircraft dealerships that are involved that it's come about. I would have never guessed the one out of Kansas City gave it up, and so it's there. There's other competition looking to grab it. So, it is from that. I would like to think it could work out, but, if it's meant to be, it is. But the hangar, I've got a major investor that's willing to come in with me on that. I just never would have guessed we'd have, the economy is there now. We've got the demands in the hangars. We've seen it for years with T hangars being full, but we're starting to see it into the larger aircraft too. So there's a lot of things that have developed just this summer that just, I don't know if they'll come around again. So I'd just like to reiterate the urgency, but I understand on the same token we got to go through due process. So
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
investment.
Other public comment? Okay, we'll go on to the meeting list.
So Friday, Vice Mayor Larson and I will be at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Commission. Okay, I didn't know if any other commissioners would also be there. Okay, it's an all-day retreat, so if there are only two of us, I guess.
If I'm not here on time next week, you just kick it off. I got a groundbreaking over on the west side of town at 4:30, so we'll see how that goes.
Break that ground quickly.
Yeah, I'm not going to speed. Any other calendar items? Okay.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Motion from Commissioner Herbert, second from Commissioner Ananda. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you all very much.